Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Tuesday, November 4th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, a Supreme Court ruling challenges NIH's authority but leaves vital public health research hanging in the balance. Plus, military pay is once again a pressure point in the shutdown fight. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. More than 211,000 people have left federal service since January. Tens of thousands of employees of contractors are also newly unemployed after the Trump administration cut spending and terminated contracts. In this week's Federal Report, Federal News Network executive editor Jason Miller tells the story of two job seekers and what others can learn from their 6-month saga. Jason, thanks for joining me to tell this important tale.
Always a pleasure, Terry, and welcome back.
Thank you. It's great to be back. Let's start with the experience of the federal employee who's been on administrative leave since April. What's going on there?
This is Mark, and we'll use it as a pseudonym. Mark was a little hesitant to kind of come out and talk about himself, but I can tell you a lot about him. He's been on administrative leave since April from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where he's worked for more than 15 years in operations. Mark said, hey, the handwriting is on the wall. It looks like they're going to close down my agency. I better start looking for a new job. I don't want to leave the government, he told me. He says, I enjoy my job. There's a reason why I've been working for the government this long. But listen, if there's not going to be a job for me, I have to, like everybody else, pay my bills. So I got to find a job. So since April, he's submitted 103 job applications. He's gotten 24 interviews and unfortunately 0 offers. And I think this is very hard on him. Right now he's still getting paid through because he's on administrative leave because of the court cases and such that CFPB are going through. But his challenge is what's going to happen when that runs out? Where am I going to be? What job am I going to have? How do I find that job? He is someone who's married. They have kids. They live in Virginia. So as you know, Terry, as I know, as we all know, it's not an easy time. And that's just one example of someone who's had some challenges, been close on interviews, been in the final round 5 or 6 different times, been runner-up several times, but just can't get that next job. And I don't think Mark is by himself there.
Certainly, we hear from a lot of folks, the federal workforce is highly qualified white-collar positions. They're all in competition with each other. How does Mark's experience compare to what those in the private sector are experiencing?
I talked to someone who's in a very similar situation. We'll call this person Rachel. Again, a pseudonym. Again, this person was happy to talk to us, just didn't want their name and their situation maybe made public. Rachel has been unemployed since April when her contract at the Treasury Department was basically doged. They lost their contract and she lost her job. Since April, she has submitted 137 applications, gotten 21 interviews. Among those was 3 letters of commitments. So if a company wins an award, she'd be on the contract. Unfortunately, the company has not won that contract, so therefore she has not gotten a new job. She has had one job offer, which she turned down, and she tells me maybe I shouldn't have when I look back at it. But, when you get a job offer in, let's say, May or June, you think there'll be better jobs ahead of me. And here we are in now November, and Rachel is still looking for a job. And a couple of things that stand out to me about what her story, very similar to Mark's story, frustration about, hey, there's a lot of competition. Her experience has been basically with artificial intelligence and some frustration. Hey, a lot of companies are using AI to scrape resumes to eliminate maybe what they call the riffraff of that initial interview. But they're also maybe not looking at the people themselves. Rachel feels like, I've been in the government contracting world for 5 years. I've had a successful private sector experience before then. I'm adaptable. I learn new skills. I have a lot of a breadth of experience to bring to any company. But if your resume doesn't meet the exact wording of what the AI is looking for, then you don't even make it past the headhunter. You don't make it past that initial screening. And I think that's a lot of frustration that this person, Rachel, is facing right now.
Those are certainly some disturbing and disheartening experiences. Did Mark and Rachel say anything about the lessons they've learned in the process or how they're staying resilient and best preparing for success?
You're right. Their experiences are unfortunately all too similar, and I think that frustration is growing. It's easy to be hopeless. It's easy to be frustration. It's easy to be disgusted with the situation. And both Rachel and Mark said they've gone through those different cycles. Sometimes, for instance, and I know this sounds kind of very simple, but Mark says, I go on walks, I exercise, I vent to people. I've been with other feds who are looking for jobs, and we kind of get together and see, hey, I'm not the only one that's suffering or struggling through this. He even said, Mark said, I'm trying to relearn Spanish and ensuring that my career doesn't define me, but I can define myself. The other thing that they both have talked about is the network, how important the network is, getting out there and introducing themselves and meeting people, going to conferences when they can, reaching out to people who maybe they haven't talked to in years and not feeling bad about that. And, I've talked to some experts in the field, and they said that is one of the most important things to do, and not to feel bad that, hey, I know I haven't talked to you in 6 months or 6 years, but I'm looking for a job, and I thought maybe you could help me. And I think that is really the frustration that they see, and they have to put themselves out there. I talked to Karen Lee. Karen's the co-founder and executive director of Feds Forward. They're former federal executives who have come together to try to help currently, feds who are looking for jobs or former feds looking for jobs. And she said one, basic mistake they see is how feds underestimate their value, that they rely too much on USA-style jobs resume and formats that don't translate well out of government. So I think there's some things that they're both learning about themselves, Rachel and Mark, and there's things that feds generally can learn by talking to others, understanding where they stand.
As you've listened to these stories and you've listened to what Feds Forward is saying, are there some common mistakes that job seekers need to avoid in the process?
There definitely are, and I think there's not just, job seekers for federal that are former feds or contractors, but all of us to really keep in mind. I spoke with Larry Schlesinger. He is the founder and CEO of the Schlesinger Management Services, a firm that helps companies find senior executives. And he says, yes, job searching can be daunting. It can be a little intimidating, but there are some common mistakes, as you said, that really job seekers need to avoid.
The resume is not crisp. It doesn't focus on accomplishments. If there is an opportunity in the application process to include a cover letter or some way of explaining why you're interested in this specific job, they don't write a very focused message about why this job interests them. Their application looks like a form letter that maybe they've sent to 50 places today, and those get weeded out quickly. Sometimes people are a little too modest in what they've accomplished, and you need to focus on your skills, what you've accomplished, and why you can be useful to the next employer.
Karen Lee said very similar things, right? Federal employees are very mission-driven. They resiliency. They bring things that companies are really desperate right now. And federal employees, former ones, have worked through budget uncertainty. They manage complex stakeholder relationships. All of these value propositions you really need to articulate, and you need to articulate clearly, because if you don't, then you're just another resume that's in the mix. And again, as Rachel has talked about, the AI is looking for certain words, and that's not really going to get you through it. At the same time, resiliency is a huge piece to this. Both Rachel and Mark talked about their own personal resiliency. They have their bad moments. They have their times when they're frustrated, when they're depressed, but they also understand that they need to push through and figure out the way forward. And in fact, Larry Schlesinger from Schlesinger Management Services says resiliency among job seekers is both an important trait and a way to help you in the future.
Keep in mind, this is a very subjective process. And it could be that they picked the wrong person, and they might realize 2 months from now they picked the wrong person, and maybe they'll come back to you. So if you get turned down, if you advance pretty far and you think you got to the short list and you had a couple rounds of interviews, if they come and say, bad news, we just loved you, but we found somebody else who we thought was a better fit, send them a letter, send an email back to them saying, thank you so much for considering me. I really enjoyed all the conversations. I hope we can stay in touch. If you have any opportunities in the future where you think I could be a good candidate, I hope you'll let me know. Don't burn bridges. There's no reason to. Life is too short. The world is too short. Washington's a small town. You will come across some of these people in the future because they're going to leave the organization. You're going to be somewhere else and you're going to cross paths. So all of these bad outcomes have a good byproduct, which is that you have expanded your network. You obviously impressed people to some degree by being asked to interview for a second round or a third round before they decided to go somewhere else.
And in fact, Schlesinger says really the whole point of this is you're not going to get a job by throwing your resume on top of the pile. You're going to get a job by getting out there, putting yourself and introducing yourself to people, making those connections. And I think that's really the one big lesson that I think both Rachel and Mark have experienced themselves is even though they maybe are a little bit introverted, you've got to put yourself out there. You've got to shake that hand. You've got to make new relationships and revisit old ones.
Thanks, Jason. It seems like the more that technology comes into play in the job search and recruiting, the more the personal connection seems to be important.
Without a doubt, and I think both people who are looking for jobs today are finding that out.
That's Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller. Jason, thanks for this story.
Always a pleasure.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Still to come, military pay is once again a pressure point in the shutdown fight. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Military pay is always front and center of any government shutdown, but it can also serve as a motivator to get members of Congress moving before they go on too long. On the other side, though, are the service members themselves, many of whom rely solely on that paycheck to get through their daily lives. To get some insight on the impact of this particular shutdown on today's military, Federal News Network's Eric White spoke with Jim Whaley, CEO of the nonprofit Mission Roll Call and a 20-year Army veteran himself.
Mr. Whaley, thank you so much for taking the time.
Eric, thanks for having me. I look forward to it.
Absolutely. So just start off the bat with getting some of your thoughts on what you're hearing from folks that are currently serving and, even the veterans themselves. This is affecting military benefits as well, I'm sure. What's going on your side of things?
Sure. Well, first of all, there are plenty of debates worth having in Washington, but service members' pay is not one of them. Every time Washington shuts down, veterans and service members, their families become collateral damage in these political fights, and it disrupts pay. It affects morale. And we have service members now worried about how they're going to make ends meet. How are they going to pay for groceries? How are they going to pay for childcare? How are they going to get gas in their car to get to the jobs? It's also, as I mentioned, it affects morale because when you're worried about those things, you may not be focused on what you need to do. And then, as we all know, the military has a lot of dangerous missions out there. So it's unfortunate that this continues, and we're hopeful that two sides can get together and fix this problem quickly.
What sort of resources are out there we'll start right there just because that's the most important thing. What resources are there available for service members that are going without pay? I imagine nonprofits like yourself try to fill some of the gaps that they're seeing in services, but what else can be done to help these folks that are going through this?
Well, unfortunately, there's not one organization across the country that fills that void. So in many cases, it's done by local communities, food banks, church pantries, things like that veterans and their families and service members can go to. We have on our website a number of organizations under our resource directory that veterans and active duty military can go to and find help in different areas, homelessness, suicide, all those sort of things. I think it's important, Eric, for listeners to understand that we have 18 million veterans across our country. And when you think about their spouses, dependents, and things like that, you're talking 30 plus million. That's a sizable voter block. That's a sizable amount of people that have served their country or know someone who has served their country. And right now, even before this shutdown occurred, 1 in 4 veterans and active duty military have food insecurity issues. I'll let that sink for a minute, because what that means is 1 in 4 are not sure how or when their next meal is going to be provided. And when we think about active duty falling into that category, that's just an embarrassment for our country. So when you add in inflation, when you add in the cost of living that everybody agrees has gone up, and now a shutdown, you can see why all these things exacerbate an already difficult situation. So I think it's important to also understand that during the shutdown, a couple key programs have been completely shut down. One is the Staff Sergeant Gordon Fox Suicide Prevention Grant, which helps community-based suicide programs and rapid response. That stopped. Support services for veteran families stopped. Healthcare for homeless veterans, not going on. And rural access network for veterans, the most dire situation is when we have veterans that are so far away from a VA hospital in the rural America and they don't have anybody to connect to and they're in financial straits. That stopped. So this shutdown has profound effects. And I think veteran issues are corollary to recruitment issues. So, we're already barely hitting marks when it comes to recruitment. Shutdown pay, low pay as it is, we all should not be surprised as a nation if we have trouble hitting our numbers.
We're speaking with Jim Whaley. He's the CEO of Mission Roll Call. Congress typically tries its best to almost shield military members and veterans from the effects of a government shutdown just because, nobody likes to be the ones that, seen as taking away military pay and benefits. But even during a partial government shutdown, you just laid out a couple of programs when they are able to, eke out the last paycheck like they did this month. I imagine that it's still not cutting it, so to speak, just because, as you mentioned, some of those programs that many aren't aware of, that many rely on, do fall through the cracks even during a partial government shutdown. Is that the case, or am I blowing that out of proportion?
No, I think it's the uncertainty, right? I think you're right on target. The uncertainty of not knowing if your pay is going to kick in next month or, because we all know, and I applaud the administration of figuring a way around to make sure that the military active duty continue to get paid. And then for those that don't know, the Coast Guard falls under the Homeland Security, so Homeland Security figured a way to pay them. But that is not a long-term solution. That was a stopgap measure. Thanks to them to do that. That has not happened before. So they found a way around it, and the military community applauds that efforts. I think the frustration that the military community has is that these are important programs. We still have 20 veterans every day committing suicide. We still have 35,000 plus veterans homeless every night. We still have 1 in 4 active duty and veterans, as I said earlier, food insecurity issues. So when you add this to the top of it, it only pours accelerant on an already nasty fire that all of us want to put out. And I think as a country, we have to do better to make sure that we have, a government that takes responsibility, that sets standards for critical programs, don't get cut, and takes the partisanship out of it. Military shouldn't have to suffer during this political brinkmanship that's going on right now.
Yeah, long term, that's what I wanted to finish up with here. We could be having this conversation in 2018, 2015, 97, and it still seems as if every time it happens, as I mentioned in the intro, it's military pay that is always the thing that pulls us out of the fire because everyone wants to make sure they are paid. Are you aware of any ideas or legislation that has been proposed to just kind of blanket the military from when things don't come together on Capitol Hill to make sure that at least they are getting paid even when shutdowns like this occur? I'm just curious if there's anything that you've heard of or legislation that you all have lobbied for to improve things going forward.
No, I don't. And I think it's a two-edged sword in some ways, right? We certainly want, in one way I'm saying, we need to make sure that these programs are funded, that veterans are taken care of. But I also think, and you brought it up earlier, that the riding crop, right, that forces them to the bargaining table, in some ways we have to keep that in this program because otherwise this would drag out. And no one wants to see any Americans suffering during a shutdown. Of course, we're focused on veterans and their families, but I think we need to think long and hard about how we come up with a better way that this doesn't continue to shut down because it affects markets. It affects investment. It affects daily life for people. I think it's also important to realize that right now, 80% of the recruits that join the military come from households that had veterans in their lives, either mother or father or an uncle or brother. And when you see this year after year, Eric, like you mentioned, it's going to affect that. At some point, those family members aren't going to recommend that to their family members. And we're an all-volunteer force, so we can't take that for granted. And we have to make sure that those that raised their right hand, signed a blank check for this country, saying I'll defend it and I'm willing to give my life in that process, that they do not fall as a victim in this process of, as I said earlier, political brinkmanship. And we're hopeful that resolution is not far off in the horizon.
Almost on the front lines on two fronts, keeping our government open for us and riding things out just to make sure that Congress keeps working, right?
That's right. That's right.
Jim Whaley is the CEO of Mission Roll Call. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Eric, and thanks for covering this important story.
And you can find this interview along with more information on our website. Head to federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.
Still to come, a new retirement system promises modernization. But for now, it's creating more questions than answers. But first, a Supreme Court ruling challenges NIH's authority but leaves vital public health research hanging in the balance. You're listening to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Supreme Court's partial stay in a case against NIH has left dozens of public health studies in legal limbo. At the center are canceled grants focused on vaccine hesitancy, LGBTQ health, and racial disparities, topics critics say were targeted for political reasons. Here to explain the ruling and its impact on scientific independence are Dr. Susan Poland and Shalini Goel Agarwal. Dr. Poland is Associate Executive Director for Public Affairs and Advocacy with the American Public Health Association. Ms. Agarwal co-leads Project Democracy's Free Expression and Right to Dissent team. Dr. Poland, Ms. Agarwal, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thanks.
Dr. Poland, I want to start with you. The American Public Health Association filed a lawsuit against the National Institutes of Health for targeting research on disfavored topics and populations. Tell us about what you heard from your constituency that incited the case.
We have members who are researchers in academic institutions and a variety of other places, and they focus on trying to make populations healthier. You can't do that without understanding all populations. And so what we were hearing is that their ability to do their research was stopped because their funding was rescinded, or their opportunity to do research was stopped because the proposals were not being considered on things like vaccines or DEI or LGBTQ plus issues. All of these things are critical because you cannot predict at the beginning of research what you're going to find out at the end. And so by taking away these what are called disfavored populations, you're basically impacting the entire population.
And were researchers in mid-project when the funds were pulled, or were they new projects, pending projects?
They're throughout the process. So some were had already received their funding, and they were mid-project. Some were in the process of being reviewed and were fairly far along and were expecting to receive support for their work, and they were cut off. And then there were some earlier in the process, along with training people. And that was another important piece of this work.
So Ms. Agarwal, tell us about the case. How did the litigation shape up, and what's the status of the case so far?
Sure. So we brought the lawsuit on behalf of APHA, which is a wonderful public health organization, along with the UAW, a union, IBIS, which is a reproductive research organization in Massachusetts, and a number of private researchers. So the folks whose actual work was being funded by these NIH grants. And on behalf of all of these plaintiffs, we filed a lawsuit against HHS and NIH in federal court, primarily alleging that the change in agency priorities that the agency was trying to effectuate by slashing research to these disfavored topics was what's called arbitrary and capricious. So it violated the Administrative Procedure Act. And basically what that means is that they didn't make a reasonable decision and they didn't explain themselves reasonably at the time. So, for example, with the DEI grant terminations. Sometimes if a grant had the word diverse in the proposal somewhere, that was enough to terminate. If a grant had included as one subject, like one set of population that it was dealing with transgender individuals, that was enough to terminate. If a grant helped to support training for a researcher from a group that had been traditionally not well represented in the research field, for example, someone whose family had been on food stamps or had not graduated college, that was enough of a reason to terminate. So that sort of broad-based and almost haphazard, frankly, cutting of research was arbitrary. That was essentially the claim. We also brought constitutional claims, but ultimately the court ruled on the Administrative Procedure Act claim.
And what was the ruling?
The court agreed with us that, yes, this is arbitrary and capricious to just cut these grants. It's especially galling where you see NIH has statutory mandates. So like Congress has set out that NIH should be specifically addressing disparate impacts between different populations, addressing minority health, and making sure to promote greater diversity within the research field. So those were those were explicit mandates from Congress that the NIH was just flouting completely. And so the court concluded in a really, strong opinion that the directives that the agency had issued were unlawful, arbitrary and capricious, so he set them aside. In addition, he said any grant terminations that were conducted pursuant to those directives, those would also be set aside so that they were, had to be, the result of that was that the grant money had to then be restored to the researchers.
And have the grants been restored?
So our understanding is that for most of our plaintiffs, so most of the APHA members, or for the APHA members we represent, and for the other plaintiffs, that the grants were restored. After that, there was a Supreme Court intervention, so that has affected the prospects going forward. But at least as we understand it, the grants were largely restored.
I'm speaking with Dr. Susan Poland. She's the Associate Executive Director for Public Affairs and Advocacy with the American Public Health Association, and Shalini Agarwal, who co-leads Protect Democracy's Free Expression and the Right to Dissent team. So, Dr. Poland, let me come back to you. What are the broader public health consequences if we terminate research on things like vaccine hesitancy or LGBTQ health or racial disparities? What are you hearing from communities out there?
So as I said earlier, when you start research, even if you're focusing on a specific population, the implications of that research are often much broader. And so what we're hearing is that people are not going to be able to understand and will lose the capacity to or lose years in our understanding of everything from cancer prevention to heart disease and stroke to things to where and what issues we might have with vaccines and what are safety and efficacy issues related to vaccines. So all of the ways that we're trying to improve the public's health are going to be undermined by this, even though ostensibly it is for specific populations, the implication is much broader.
And are your researchers able to restart their programs now that the grant funding is flowing again?
That's another issue for those. There are a number of our researchers and members who are able to be part of the lawsuit, but not all. So for those who were able to be part of the lawsuit, for the most part, it was a break, but it wasn't a break that was so dramatic that they're not going to be able to restart. But for those people who are not able to be part of the lawsuit for a whole array of reasons, they are lost. Their ability to do their work is going to be very difficult. And yes, they may be able to get other funding to restart it, but they're going to lose months and maybe even years before that happens, which means that we are going to lose months and even years of understanding the implications for everybody. And that is hugely problematic.
There have been political swings in the science space before. Does this one feel different to you? Are we seeing a shift in how politically sensitive medical topics are being handled now?
It absolutely does. I mean, what we've seen before are restrictions on research at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention related to guns. And that was a content issue, but this is directed at people. And that's a very different issue. And so it's targeting communities and saying that these communities are not worthy of us doing the research. And that is just a horrible way for government to act, to say that some parts of our population do not have enough value that we want to understand how to keep them healthy.
And so, Ms. Agarwal, let me come back to you. What is the next step here, legally or legislatively?
Sure. Yeah, I'll go back to the Supreme Court decision because I feel like I did not fully explain that earlier. So after the trial court issued its judgment setting aside this guidance, the directives that the NIH had put out, the agency sought a stay. So that's basically like, while we're resolving this case, which will take several months for the parties to brief and the courts to hear on appeal. In that time, will you please, court, stop the effect of the trial court's ruling? And so they sought a stay from the district court itself, and the court said no, denied the stay. Same thing happened at the First Circuit. And then they sought a stay at the Supreme Court. And this is on what's called the shadow docket, where there's, really limited briefing and no argument and not much explanation for the decisions made by the court in that sort of abbreviated stay posture. And there, the Supreme Court issued a really fractured ruling. Basically, in a really short page and a half, the court did agree to stay part of the lower court's ruling. So I guess the take-home point from the Supreme Court was it did not stay the ruling as it applied to the directives. So the policy documents that say, NIH is deprioritizing these subjects and we're not going to fund them, that part of the court's ruling, saying that that's arbitrary and capricious and has to be set aside, the Supreme Court did not touch that part of the ruling and said, we'll deal with that at a later time. But it did stay the ruling as it applied to the terminations. And it said, grant terminations, that where the effect is that you have to restore the funding. That feels to us like a contract, and we think that you can't get that relief in this federal court. You have to go to the specialized contract court called the Court of Federal Claims. And it was a really fractured decision in that 4 justices would have let the full ruling stand from below, and 4 justices would have stayed the entire thing. And we had 1 justice, Amy Coney Barrett, who was the decisive vote and sort of split her decision. So we are currently in the First Circuit Court of Appeals. So this is, the level up from the trial court. And we are now doing briefing on the merits. So this is not just like whether the decision of the trial court should be stayed, but was the decision of the trial court correct? And so we will hopefully prevail there. And, either way, I imagine we'll end up at the Supreme Court again. And then the Supreme Court will actually issue, we hope, an opinion that will have lasting significance other than just, unsigned or not a short shadow docket ruling.
That's really helpful framing. And Dr. Poland, let me come back to you then. Is APHA sensing any interest from Congress in getting engaged to create a framework that prevents this sort of pendulum swinging in the future?
Well, we are hearing concern, but not hearing that action is going to be a priority in the short term. And I think a lot of this is everybody's taking a wait and see attitude and watching how this all plays out in the courts, watching how it all plays out in reality. But there are so many different ways that public health is under attack that it is really hard to get a path forward on any one of these things. I want to, if I can, just correct something I said earlier about CDC. And what I said was that CDC earlier had restrictions on research, and it actually wasn't. The restriction was on the ability to do advocacy, and it therefore had a chilling effect on research. So it wasn't as direct as this is. And I also want to add that in addition to the research, it's the grants and funding for training that have been cut. And that means that whole populations of early career professionals or professional or students who are making their way through graduate school supported by these programs are no longer able to finish their PhDs or finish their research. So we're losing a whole generation of researchers as well.
I've been speaking with Dr. Susan Poland, Associate Executive Director for Public Affairs and Advocacy with the American Public Health Association, and Shalini Goel Agarwal, who co-leads Project Democracy's Free Expression and Right to Dissent team. Thank you both so much for joining me and explaining this really crucial case.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, a new retirement system promises modernization. But for now, it's creating more questions than answers. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Federal employees planning to retire are now navigating ORA, the new online platform replacing OPM's paper-based process. The system is designed to streamline retirement, but early users are facing delays, confusion, and communication breakdowns. For insight on what's working and what's not, Federal News Network's Eric White spoke with Tiago Glieger, a retirement planning expert at RMG Advisors.
We're talking about the new ORA system, or I guess, is it ORA system? I'll let you correct my pronunciation for federal retirees. Obviously, that system is going to get used a lot over the next coming months. If what has been happening recently is any sign of what's to come. Tell me about what's going on with this system and what feds are saying, the ones that have been using it have been saying about it.
Yeah, Eric, this new system, so we call it ORA. I think that's how most people are calling it, as you said. So this is a brand new system. And honestly, it's been confusing a lot of people. Okay, it's replacing the old paperwork that a lot of federal employees had to fill out, the SF 3107, as they were going to retire from their agencies. But I think the big problem here, Eric, is they're finding that a lot of the HR departments are just simply overwhelmed, right? We had a lot of people that were leaving. We have bottlenecking of a lot of people that are leaving on DRP as well. And so they just can't provide the kind of support that they used to before. So a lot of these questions start to pile up. It's a brand new system, and there's not enough people in place to help answer those questions. Retirement is already a pretty stressful process for people, right? So then on top of that, not having a clear process or information about a new system only adds to the anxiety. And so when it was first launched, everyone hoped that OPM was going to say, this is going to be faster, it's going to be smoother, it's going to require less people. And OPM actually said the opposite. They said at first, it might actually take longer. Okay. They are very hopeful that over time, this is going to be a good system. But right now, there's a lot of moving parts that have to come together for all of that efficiency to really start showing up. And as you guys have seen, Eric, there's tens of thousands of federal employees retiring. We just had the first wave here on 9/30. We're going to have another wave here on 12/31. And so it's really, really tough for people to get answers to the system.
Yeah, sort of ready, fire, aim approach that we love here in the USA. Walk us through what a federal employee should expect when they decide to retire under this new system. What are some of the major changes from the old system? Not that anybody retires more than once, hopefully, but what exactly are they looking at from a landscape perspective?
Yeah, so what it used to be is that a lot of agencies would run the GRB platform retirement estimator for federal employees retiring. And the GRB platform was effectively a repository of your federal service, and it would give you information on what retirement could look like, estimates of your pension, things like that. So then we run into problem number one. A lot of agencies cut GRB. So now federal employees are saying, well, what does my retirement estimate look like? How many creditable years do I have? That system is no longer there. So then agencies are not even able to provide that information. But presuming you're still going to move forward with the actual retirement process, first step is you have to notify your HR office that you're ready to retire, right? You can send them an email generally and say, I believe I'm eligible. I'd like to start the retirement planning or the retirement process. And this is because the HR group has to initiate the ORA system in most cases. Every agency has a little bit of a different process, but this is what the majority of the groups are doing, okay? You have to remember what's different here is now HR is swamped. There's tons of people retiring. There's less of them around to be able to do this, which is causing some of the bottleneck. Once HR begins the ORA process, you're given access to it. And again, this is going to replace the SF 3107, which is the retirement form. And so now it's actually easier because instead of filling out a government form, you're just going through a system online and it's asking you questions one by one. Everyone has filled out those kinds of forms before. So it's actually pretty easy, as we've seen with some of our clients. And what it does is it takes your answers and pre-fills the form for you, which is a nice service, okay? Once you submit that part, it's really important that a federal employee stay alert, because a lot of times HR, they may kick it back if they need additional information. There's something that's missing. So you have to check to make sure you have it. You have to check to make sure you don't need to do additional work on the ORA system for that. That's when it moves to payroll. Once it moves to payroll, they finalize all of your hours, which can take a month to a month and a half just at payroll itself before it goes to OPM. So if you think about it, we're talking a month at payroll, could be a month before HR actually gets around to being able to initiate the system for you. We're at 2 months so far. Once it hits OPM, that's when the official clock starts, as OPM likes to describe it. Okay, and there's some uncharted waters here because OPM has not really handled A, this new system before, and B, this many federal employees retiring all at the same time. So they release information. There's some congressional report that gets put out there that talks about how many applications are coming into the system and what is the average processing time month over month. We've been seeing that go up and up and up over the last 3 months. I expect it's going to continue to get worse, right? So we're talking 3 months at the agency level plus whatever time OPM is going to need for themselves.
We're talking with financial planner Tiago Glieger. So other than those long timelines, well, we can call them unknown timelines, as you say, what are some of the other issues that federal employees are seeing so far with the system? It sounds like it is going through some growing pains, but are there any fundamental flaws with it that people are just not liking?
I think some of the challenging questions that the system asks them are things like, how much withholding do you want to do on your taxes? Or what do you want to do about life insurance? And before, there were some guidance in the forms and how to be thinking about some of these things. The system is a little bit more streamlined, and it just asks you the question. Well, if you haven't gone through the process of creating a financial plan, how do you know how much insurance do you need? What kind of tax liability are you expected to have? So federal retirees are called upon to make these decisions in real time as they're filling out the form, and they don't really have the information to be able to answer those questions. Okay. The other issue that we are running into, and this one hasn't been too much, is that sometimes people don't get the notification of additional action that they need. Sometimes it gets stuck in their spam email. So this is something that, again, it's those bumps that they're trying to pull together. There are a lot of systems in the background that have to coordinate with each other. And as any brand new system that gets launched, there's always stuff that's going to break. So I'm sure some of that's going to be a problem too.
Gotcha. All right. And so what can folks do if they are looking to retire? You're a financial planner. I guess we're talking to the right person. How can they financially prepare for any delays that might occur because, some of those dates don't line up and, you don't want to be caught in between paychecks, as they say, and without anything coming in. What sort of precautions can those looking to retire take?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Eric. I think the first thing that federal retirees should remember is that you will get your annual leave lump sum. Okay, so that comes pretty quickly in our experience with clients right after you leave. So you get your final paycheck, and then shortly thereafter, you get your lump sum. So depending on how many hours you have, you're going to get a big check that's going to help you to meet your expenses between when you leave and no longer have an income and when the pension actually fully starts. There are also, in most cases, an interim payment where it's a portion of your final pension, not the exact amount. But again, we don't want to count on that because there's cases where people don't get it. So the biggest thing is that, let's say you're planning to retire at December 31st. Now is the time to start boosting your cash reserves. So what do I mean by that? Cash in the bank is going to be really important here. So this might mean, and it sounds a little counterintuitive, but might mean maybe don't put as much in the thrift savings plan for the rest of the year if you know you're going to retire, okay? Yes, you have access to the TSP if you are retiring within a certain age. The age is 55 for most people. But cash in the bank is that much easier to access, okay? It's already been taxed in most cases. So if you reduce your TSP contribution, that means your take-home pay goes up and you get to start accumulating that cash. I would also think about what kind of expenses maybe you have coming up, right? The general guide for people is we like around 6 months worth of your monthly expenses in cash in the bank at all times. And because we might be looking at delays on your pension starting, you might want to increase that a little bit more. So if you got big renovations you were planning to do on the home, maybe postpone that for a little bit until you get greater clarity around OPM's timeline for this stuff. And the last one, and this one's a little bit controversial as well, but it depends on how old you are. If you leave prior to the age of 55, which a lot of people have done this year, you technically don't have access to the TSP funds unpenalized, unless you are law enforcement or special provisions, 1811s, things like that, right? So what you can look at is a potential TSP loan. You can get up to $50,000, and that comes without that 10% early withdrawal penalty, which is kind of nice because you can put that in your bank account, use it or don't use it, but at least it creates extra cash flow for you, okay? Of course, check with your financial professionals, make sure that this is something that is feasible within your plan, but that's been a really solid one to help bridge people over.
Uncertainty is the word of the day for a lot of federal employees, particularly those that are retiring even. So any advice on handling that aspect of things? You're already going through the anguish of entering into a new stage of your life, having all of this in the background of shutdowns and potential furloughs and things of that nature. What can you tell people that are going through this right now?
I would say for folks to rely on your planning. This is something that creates great peace of mind, just knowing what you're going to do in which scenario. So if this happens, if it takes longer, if the markets crash in the middle of your waiting for your pension, all of these things, if you can think ahead of what those potential problems may be and what you're going to do if those things happen, or what you're going to do in preparation to hedge some of those risks, that gives you great peace of mind. Okay. We have to be careful about watching the economy and the news around the markets. The markets are very volatile, and you always have different opinions and people talking about what the markets are going to do next. We have to be careful because that creates a lot of anxiety for retirement. And I think, too, the more information you have, the better. OPM has a really, really helpful retirement quick guide, which, we can give you guys the link, and I'm sure you guys have this already. You can put it in the show notes. But the OPM retirement quick guide is super helpful. It walks you through the process so you know what to expect. And in fact, there is one additional resource that is actually your benefits officer directory. This is something that OPM maintains pretty regularly, and it's the HR person in charge at your office. In case the process is just stuck, and if you can't get answers, you can't get anywhere, this is a place you can look for to find out who's in charge at your agency to get the answers you need.
Tiago Glieger is a private wealth advisor with RMG Advisors. Thank you so much for filling us in.
Thanks, Eric.
And we'll post a link to this interview along with a link to that guide at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive.
Though many federal employees have been through shutdowns in the past, a significant majority say things are very different this time around. About 70% of respondents to a recent Federal News Network survey say the current shutdown feels much less certain than usual. Some survey takers also say the Trump administration's recent actions have only built on the challenges feds have faced this year. Here with more on the survey results is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Terry, nice to be with you as always.
Well, tell us about this survey. What did people have to say about why this shutdown feels different?
So this won't come as much of a surprise to a lot of our audience. I think there are two key reasons that kept popping up over and over again in the survey responses on why this shutdown feels so different and so much less certain than normal. One of those is the new threat of reductions in force that have come from the Trump administration, and that in relation or in the context of the shutdown. And then the other reason was the lack of guarantee on back pay for furloughed employees. That's putting a lot of extra stress, extra concern on a lot of federal workers who right now are going without pay. Many respondents, talked about, how this is the first shutdown where they feel like they are truly threatened by the administration, used words like unpredictable, stressful, unstable. And like you mentioned, 70% of respondents say that this shutdown in particular was different from anything that they've experienced in the past for those who have been through a shutdown before. So, long story short, it is quite different now.
We might have crossed a line somewhere when we get to talk about usual shutdowns and unusual shutdowns. But folks are now starting to feel an impact in their personal and their financial lives. What did survey respondents tell you there?
That's right. So just to put into a little bit of context, we are at the point where about 1.4 million federal employees have already missed their first full paychecks, and the next missed paycheck could come as soon as the end of this week. The financial strains are hitting federal employees differently, and it really just depends on your individual financial situation. What we found in the survey responses was that about 30% say they will feel a major impact on finances. 36% said there would be somewhat of an impact. So it's a little bit mixed on how much this is going to affect people individually. But I think what was a really interesting finding in this part of the survey was that it really depends on the length of the shutdown. So a lot of people talked about, if the longer the shutdown continues, the more concerned they'll be about their financial situation. And then that combined with the Office of Management and Budgets, calling into question the 2019 law that's supposed to ensure back pay. Again, that's adding a lot of financial stress to people who think, maybe I could float through the shutdown or get through the shutdown with my current financial situation, but that only rests on them getting that guarantee of back pay. So if that ends up not happening, a lot of people are concerned about how that could affect them long term as well.
And Congress has been pretty clear about saying they intend to make that back pay provision, correct?
That's right. It seems that if you look at past shutdowns, every time federal employees have been given back pay, and whether you're furloughed or accepted, it seems like that will most likely be the case. And that is what the 2019 law says, is that both groups of employees are guaranteed back pay. So it's unclear how that exactly is going to play out in the timeline of that, but it seems like the intent, at least from most lawmakers, would be to provide back pay in that sense.
The survey also asked how folks believe the shutdown will affect their workplaces. What did you hear there?
So one common concern about how this would impact the workplace is really just morale. One of the survey questions asked about how the shutdown is impacting morale in the workplace, and more than 70% say that it has gotten worse as a result of the shutdown. But on top of just the feeling or the general situation in the workplace, employees also talked about the effects of the shutdown on their actual work. So 45% of survey respondents say it's going to have a major impact, and about 35% of respondents say there would be somewhat of an impact. But again, similar to the trend in financial concerns for federal employees, a lot said that it really depends on the length of the shutdown. So they expect the longer the shutdown goes on, the bigger workloads that will be piling up, the bigger backlogs there will be, and the more they'll have to work through once the shutdown ends. Or several respondents also talked about how the delays and changes throughout the year due to the Trump administration really overhauling the federal workforce is compounding the effects of the shutdown. So while there have been some changes with like the hiring freeze, for example, and other ways that the Trump administration has reduced the federal workforce, that in combination with not being able to do work is making employees feel like once they get back, things will be much worse than they possibly could have been otherwise.
Drew, you did this survey at the beginning of October, so there were a lot of things that happened in September that led into this on top of the shutdown. Refresh us on what respondents experienced in the days leading up to the shutdown in late September.
So if we think back to those last few days of the month of September, at the time there was a lack of clarity from a lot of agencies on their preparations for the shutdown. Employees who filled out the survey talked about how typically during past shutdowns, they'll see things at least several days or more in advance in terms of what agencies are planning for their contingency plans. So that tells you how many employees are going to be furloughed, how many are expected to continue working. A lot of respondents say that their agencies gave either conflicting information, delayed information, or just no information at all. So in terms of percentages, the most common answer was that people believed their agencies were somewhat prepared. That was about 35% of the respondents. about 1/3 of respondents say their agency was not at all prepared. So there's quite a big mix there. But the bottom line here is that a lot of federal employees, again, felt like it was a different preparation leading up to the shutdown.
And looking forward, what did they say about the long-term impacts of this shutdown? What are they expecting?
A lot of people in the context of the long-term impacts really were raising concerns about the reductions in force that the Trump administration is looking to conduct. They say that will cause additional stress, additional apprehension for a lot of federal employees. Many spoke of how their teams are already short-staffed with the reductions that have already taken place this year. Others worried about how the reductions or further layoffs could potentially affect agency mission overall. And then on top of the reductions in force as well, again, a lot of people were worried about the impact of the back pay and the potential loss of that. It is something that is just creating a lot of uncertainty for the long term with employees.
Drew, thanks for sharing the results of the survey with us.
Thank you, Terry.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman, and you can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editors are Daisy Thornton and Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.